are actually very close to each other. If you look at books about race around Darwin's time, they often talk about the Cockney race, the English country race, the Scottish race. There were drawings of the head of a typical member of the Cockney race, and the word was used quite seriously. There were maps made of where the criminal races lived. These were the rookeries. This was the East End, the melting pot of all the horrors that were going to go out and infect the rest of the population.
Race scientists and social reformers visited prisons to study the criminal races at first hand, and among them was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was terrified by the fact that the underclass were reproducing faster than the middle classes. Darwinian law had, it seemed, been turned on its head. The least fit were surviving. Reversing this situation became his mission.
Darwin had looked backwards. Where had we come from? Galton turned the telescope around and looked forward. Where were we going? And he devoted much of the rest of his life to the idea of understanding Homo sapiens, us, as a species, and trying to direct where Homo sapiens was going to go in order to become more sapient, more wise in the future, more of a genius, and less of what he saw, more stupid, more ignorant, and more decayed.
Galton designed a new science of human selective breeding. He dreamed of encouraging the middle classes to have more children and inhibiting breeding amongst the lower and criminal classes. And he named his new science eugenics. In the last decades of the 19th century, it became widely respected, attracting an array of high-profile supporters. In the first years of the 20th century, all the racial theories developed in the Victorian age, eugenics, social Darwinism, and scientific racism, came together in a forgotten outpost of colonialism. This is Namíbia, but at the dawn of the 20th century, it was the German colony of southwest Africa, and home to an ancient people called the Herero. In 1904, they rebelled against the brutality of German rule. What followed was to prefigure the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp. In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards. The most infamous and deadly of the camps was at a place called Shark Island. In this desolate place, on the southern edge of Africa, 3,500 people were exterminated with a speed and efficiency that was to become the hallmark of 20th century slaughter.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this for me is the central thing. This is not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
Today, Shark Island is a campsite for tourists. The Africans who were frozen and starved to death here have been almost erased from memory. But a century after the Namibian genocide, the true horror of what happened on Shark Island is beginning to re-emerge. In a recently discovered mass grave, just a few kilometers from the site of Shark Island, lie some of the victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Other victims were denied even the meager dignity of a mass grave. They became the raw material of racial science. Their skulls, and even severed heads, were sold to museums in Europe and used to prove the inferiority of Africans. The trade in skulls was so accepted that it was even depicted on a postcard. In the aftermath of the genocide, German racial scientists continued to use Namibia as a field laboratory and the African peoples who had survived as their subjects. In 1908, a eugenicist called Eugen Fischer travelled to the small town of Rehoboth, home to a people of mixed Boer and African heritage who called themselves the Rehoboth Bastards. Fischer and his assistants spent months photographing, measuring, and examining the inhabitants of this town, people whose descendants still live here. Lying in the vaults of an archive in modern-day Namibia, Eugen Fischer's original files and photographs remain as he left them a century ago. They reveal his methods and also his aims.
Here Eugen Fischer has lined the different pictures up next to each other to try to trace very specific facial features like the eyes or the noses. And the reason he's done this is to try to show how very specific African facial features like high cheekbones and the drawn-out eyes that represent the African genes are very prominent and become more prominent through the generations. Eugen Fischer came to Namibia to prove one basic point, and that was that racial mixing was always bad, and that the African gene is dominant over the white gene.
Fischer's work in Rehoboth sealed his reputation as one of Germany's leading racial scientists. It also brought him recognition from a nation that was then experiencing the greatest influx of immigration the world had ever seen. In the first years of the 20th century, the ethnic makeup of America was being transformed as millions of immigrants poured into her great cities. Many of those who feared that mass immigration would lead to widespread racial mixing looked to the ideas of eugenics, an increasingly powerful science.
Eugenics flourished, mutated, and went out of control when it got to the United States. And the irony is that the eugenics movement in the United States, which certainly descended directly from Galton, had the great advantage of having a lot of money, a huge amount of money.
Some of that money was used to establish the Eugenics Records Office, ran by the infamous Charles Davenport. In order to defend the health and purity of the white race, Davenport and his followers sought to identify those classes and those races in America whom they considered genetically unfit. Identified and monitored, the scientists would then take control of their lives and their fertility.
Once you were identified as a certain class, it meant what school you could go to, what cemetery you could be buried in, where you could live. It was a matter of life and death. Marriage laws were established in dozens of states around the United States, saying that people could not marry outside of their group. Blacks could not marry whites, Indians could not marry blacks. In Virginia, if you married the wrong person, meaning interracial marriage, they would unmarry you. They would invalidate your marriage.
27 states passed eugenics marriage laws, and the eugenicists spread their message using the new medium of cinema. the propaganda was intended to protect the genetic health of the white race. This would be achieved by eradicating those deemed unworthy through forced mass sterilization.
They went about methodically tracking ancestry and targeting bloodlines for extinction. That's eugenics, the effort to create a white, master, blonde, blue-eyed, master race by wiping out other bloodlines until they were left only with themselves and people who resembled themselves. And what's important here is that these people thought they were saving humanity. These people thought they were liberals. They were reformers.
Eugenics was a worldwide movement. In Sweden, an official program forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, mental patients and members of the ethnic minorities. In Britain, the Eugenic Society received widespread support from across the political spectrum. But it was in Germany that the radical ideas of the American eugenics movement found its most receptive audience.
Anything connected to America would seem to be modern, progressive, scientific, democratic, reasonable, so it must be good. America was the future, the force of the future. Secondly, I think that many European eugenicists, including the Germans, like the tone adopted by American eugenicists, which was very radical and sort of no-nonsense, and they didn't use euphemisms, they said exactly what they meant.
The Americans provided more than just inspiration. American foundations also bankrolled the development of German eugenics. This was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology and Human Heredity. In the 1930s, the men and women who worked here received grants from the American Rockefeller Foundation. And the leading scientist here was the man who made his name in Namíbia, Eugen Fischer. Under the Nazis, Fischer was empowered to sterilize the racially mixed people of Germany's Rhineland, 400 of them, all children. The majority of those sterilized by the Nazis before 1939, however, were the mentally ill. But when the Nazis began their war, they abandoned sterilization in favor of adult euthanasia, the Nazi euphemism for murder. The victims of this program were amongst the first people gassed by the Nazis, but the program wasn't restricted to the mentally ill.
When they have killed the target figure of mental patients they want to kill, which is roughly 70,000 people, they slightly exceeded it. So the first thing they do then is to contact the SS, who have large numbers of what they deem to be sick concentration camp prisoners. In other words, people who might have wear glasses or be myopic or have a wooden leg or something. So they want them out of the way. So these people oblige and they take 15 or 20,000 people from the concentration camps and kill them on behalf of the SS. It's a bit like sort of contract work. And then when the SS and other people have decided they're going to go for the big project, which is to kill the Jewish population of Europe, and in particular that of Poland, which is the biggest population they're concerned with, then those people push themselves forward and say, well, hey, we can do this, we've done it, we have a record of doing this, we murder people, and they become the core personnel in all the big extermination camps.
These killing centres were the second network of concentration camps and death camps in German history. And the experts in eugenics, or race hygiene as the Germans called it, were involved not just in their day-to-day running, but also in the highest levels of planning.
It's worth reminding ourselves that the Wannsee Conference, which was the one that set up the plan for the final solution, almost half the people around that table had doctorates, PhDs, in race hygiene, or genetics, as we'd say today. So there really is a genuine link between the Galtonian agenda and the horrors which happened in Germany.
The German experts in race hygiene who assembled here at the Wannsee Villa outside Berlin dreamed of racial genocide, just like their spiritual predecessors, the race scientists and the social Darwinists of the Age of Empire. But the colonial genocides, inspired and justified by the 19th century theorists, have been written out of Europe's history. The horrors of the Shark Island death camp, the destruction of the Tasmanian Aboriginals, the 30 million victims of the Indian famines, all have been forgotten. The erasure of this memory encourages the belief that Nazi violence was an aberration in European history. Though the Holocaust itself was motivated by the fanatical anti-Semitism of the Nazis, it can also be seen as part of a longer historical continuum, one that identifies it as a logical extension of scientific racism. But this history, like the bones in the Namibian deserts, refuses to remain buried forever.